So yes, thanks for that great introduction. I am Tara Hansen. I work with Robin at the Centre, and it's my pleasure to act as your facilitator today. And I'd like to start off by just making sure everybody's got their cell phones off. And then it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers. First speaker today is Alexander Haslam. He's a senior CIFAR fellow. He's a professor of social and organizational psychology and Australian laureate fellow at the University of Queensland. His work examines how social identities and group memberships influence our interactions with others. He researches such questions as, how does belonging to groups and organizations shape the way we think, feel, and behave? And how do individuals and groups in turn shape the nature of organizations and society? Our community responder will be Franco Savoia. Franco is the non-governmental co-chair of the Aboriginal Interagency Council on Homelessness and the director of Vibrant Communities in Calgary. He was the president and CEO of the Edmonton YMCA from 2000 to 2012, when he retired after a 43-year career in the YMCA that began in 1969 at the Greater Toronto YMCA, where he worked in various positions, including vice president. In 1989, he became the CEO at St. Catharines and Niagara Falls YMCA, and over the next 11 years, he led a volunteer and staff team to build a brand new YMCA for that community that would serve nearly 12,000 members. Franco has a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Windsor and a Master of Theology from the University of Toronto. In 2002, he completed a Master of Management from McGill University in the McGill-McConnell Program for Voluntary Sector Leaders. He played a leadership role in the development of the YMC Welcome Village that opened in 2012 in Edmonton and has been a Rotarian for 22 years. So take it away, Alexander and Franco.
Thank you very much for that excellent sort of tripartite introduction. That was great. My name's Alex. I'm here from Australia. I'm going to be talking a lot about groups and kind of why and how they're good for you today. So I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the groups that I belong to. I was my family in the UK and in Australia. I belong to a very large kind of network of researchers, and much of the work that I'm going to pass off as my own today is actually theirs. It's part of a collaborative enterprise, in particular with colleagues at the University of Queensland. Obviously, too, I want to acknowledge our membership, Kath and mine and Rob's membership of CIFAR, which has been a fantastic sponsor of our work now for 10 years. Kath and I are not Canadian. You'll probably work that out from our accents, but I think we feel like we're parts of a virtual Canadian community, and that's a wonderful thing. And I think, importantly too, I think CIFAR has reinforced our sense of ourselves as citizens of the world, which is also very important. And one final thing I mustn't forget for those on the podcast, I know there's a few people in Australia, our neighbours. I want to say hello to Maureen and Carly in Ockenflower. It's 1:30 in the morning, so if you're up, top marks. Okay, and on we go. So I'm going to talk again about social identity and groups, but I want to start by explaining why that is so central to psychology and to the themes and issues that we're going to talk about today. If you start with the question, what does it mean to be human? A fairly obvious starting point is that humans are social animals, and what that means in very basic terms is that we live and have evolved to live in a range of social groups: ethnic groups, political groups, national groups, religious groups, family groups, work groups, sporting groups, interest groups, and so on. And as a result of that, a large part of our sense of self, who we think we are, is derived from membership of those social groups. Those groups, in sort of technical language, furnish us with a sense of social identity. And in another context, another time, another place, I've presented a CIFAR talk which argues effectively that who we are as individuals is very much a product and a reflection of the groups that we belong to. They provide us with bearings, direction, purpose, norms, and a whole range of other things. So if I really want to understand who you are, each of you as individuals, I could ask you to list your personality traits, and you could say, oh, I'm happy, or I'm honest, or all these kinds of things, trustworthy. But if I really wanted to know what you're like, I'd know, well, you're a woman, and you're a feminist, you belong to this neighborhood watch group, or whatever it might be, and you enjoy hockey, as seemingly everybody in Alberta does. Okay, so I learned this from the radio interview yesterday, in which everything was about hockey. I didn't realize that until yesterday, but now I do. Okay, so again, if we kind of look at what that might look like, what we're saying is that our sense of self is derived from a membership in social groups. That is reflected in everyday language in our use of terms we and us. Often psychologists treat those terms as if they're epiphenomena, as if they're not really real, they don't really relate to the self, and that the true self is about I and me. And our research, and the research of collaborators and colleagues really around the world, suggests that that's not the case. That in many ways our true self is grounded in those group memberships. And that sense of self, when I think about myself as us Australians, or us men, or us supporters of Newcastle United, or whatever it might be, then that defines me as a member of a community, and it furnishes me with a very particular sense of self that's irreducible to the sense of self that is associated with my individuality. But interestingly too, our research shows that our sense of strong individuality, strong personality, strong personal identity derives from those group memberships. So just as an example, if as an individual on my own, actually it's quite hard to get one's bearings in the social world, to have a sense of place. But for example, the fact I'm here now as a representative of CIFAR and the academic community actually gives me a place, gives me a purpose, and makes me feel stronger in myself. In a sense, it gives me the strength to present to you, it gives me a sense of what I'm meant to be doing, it allows me to overcome all manner of obstacles, not the least of which is 16 hours of jet lag. Okay, so again, whereas often psychology privileges the personal self, as if psychology is all about me and I, our work is about inverting that and saying that really psychology is much more about we and us, and that's fundamental to the way in which that psychology has evolved. Another way of thinking about what social identity kind of does is that social identity turns other into self. So, as a simple example, until a couple of weeks ago, Franco was just another person on the planet. He meant nothing to me at all, and I meant nothing to him. Okay, he was just an other. But now that we're bonded together as part of this community, this intellectual dialogue, that we actually have a sense of each other as having some common purpose. So Franco is no longer a stranger, he is part of who I am. And he has the ability, he's a reference for me, and I can get my sense of self partly from him. And similarly, so I'm attentive to what he says in a way that would not have been true 2 weeks ago. More fundamentally, a large body of research shows that that sense of social identity, a sense of your connection to other people, is the basis for a whole range of forms of group behavior. That in a sense, and this is a kind of famous line from kind of social identity literature, social identity is what makes group behavior possible. And as a result, you see, and there's again various lines of research that we've been doing over the last dozen or so years, which show that social identity is a basis for communication. Why am I talking to you and why are you listening to me? Because we share social identity. If we were out on the street and we're strangers, we would have no reason to interact with each other. We trust each other. I saw someone just leaving their handbag willy-nilly around. Why? Well, because you feel that you're part of this community. You trust the person next to you to behave in a civil manner towards you. You can kind of internalize that and take that for granted. You feel connection to people, you have a sense of solidarity. So you have collective emotions around the circumstances of the group that you're in, either positive or negative. There's a basis for influence, for organization more generally. Again, social identity, and this is our organizational work, makes processes like organization and leadership possible. You can't lead unless you can invoke a sense of social identity that connects you to potential followers. And that too is also a basis for power. That actually power comes through our ability to mobilize people in the name and the vision of a shared collective sense of what we're about. So we get power through other people, rather than power being a process of having power over people. Actually, true power is an influence process, again, grounded in social identity. Okay. Now, that's a lot of those things are things that I could talk about on another day, and perhaps you'll invite us back to do that. But for today, I'm actually a bit of a curtain raiser for Kath, who's going to talk a lot more about mental health. And she's a clinician in a way that I'm not, so I'm also a bit of a fraud. I have to fess up to that too. But I want to say those things feed into mental health because, again, social identity through those various processes is a basis for things like, and again, this is part of our ongoing research, self-esteem, control, a sense of belonging, the provision and the receipt of social support, a sense of coping, a sense of resilience, a sense of purpose, and a sense of meaning. And again, each of those things, we have colleagues who've kind of demonstrated each of those links pretty conclusively. If you want to put those things together in terms of a model, which kind of, again, one of the things that psychologists like to do is to compartmentalize the world and pretend there's social psychology over here, and clinical psychology over here, and organizational psychology there, and developmental psychology over there. Actually, our work speaks to a unity of those processes bounded in this sense of identity. And what you see is that social identity is a basis for connection, organization, and community, which then is a basis for support and coping and resilience. That leads into control, purpose, and meaning, which in turn buttresses mental health and then allows people to grow as part of a community and part of a group. That's what we refer to as the virtuous circle of social identification. And that's kind of, if you like, a very positive, rosy picture of the affordances, if you like, of social identity. However, unfortunately, we live in a world where it's not always possible for everybody to live out positive social identities. For a range of people, and probably for all of us at certain points in our lives, valued and valuable social identities will come under threat. And in particular, those threats are manifest in the form of various life transitions. Aging, we've done a lot of research on people entering care homes. Unemployment, again, losing links to your professional and work-related identities, which have defined who you are for a long period of time. Obviously, discrimination directly, if you like, attacks the value of the identities that you hold dear, whether they're gender-based or ethnically based and so on. And finally, larger scale processes like colonization or war, again, threaten those identities. And to the extent that those kinds of transitions, again, undermine a sense of social identity, then we argue, and indeed there's really bucket loads of evidence that speaks to this point, that they constitute major risks for mental health. So if you like, the obverse of the virtuous circle of social identification is a vicious circle of social atomization, in which a lack or loss of social identity is a basis for disconnection and isolation, a sense of alienation and a lack of support, frustration, anomie, listlessness in a certain sense, and then distress, depression, and dysfunction, and then that reduced sense of your place in the world at large. Now, those ideas, I've said, have really been, and really since the foundation of this CIFAR program, which has been a major driver for this research initiative, in the course of this program, which is now 12 years old, that these issues have become kind of a focus for burgeoning interest. These are just a number of papers on social identity and health for the last sort of 25 years. And again, you can sort of see that in recent years, they've really sort of taken off. And I should say, too, that those are, I think, map onto other developments in the social sciences. So if you go into the bookshop in town, you'll see a range of books which speak about the importance of the social, about the importance of community. And I think there's a broader recognition around the world about the importance of the things that we're going to be talking about today. That work speaks to the fact that social identity is central to mental health, in part because social identity is part of, if you like, the benefits of things like the environment, our sense of space, our connection to the world in which we live. Things like religion, again, a lot of the positive powers of religion comes through social identity, range of mass gatherings. Some of our research colleagues have done a lot of research in India, looking at congregations of millions of people and the ability of those to, again, foster a sense of collective well-being. Kath's done a lot of work on the role of social identity in protecting mental health and cognitive health, because actually social identity is a basis for you to engage with other people and to stretch yourself intellectually, which again, if you like, underpins cognitive performance, particularly in aging. And it's also at the heart of successful clinical interventions and, as I've already intimated, the leadership that makes those interventions possible. And again, I hope in the discussion later we'll have a little space to think about the ways in which leadership is a critical part of the processes that I'm going to talk about quickly. Okay, so there's a little bit of theory, and perhaps more than you would have liked, but I think it's very important to contextualize this in a much larger literature, a much larger body of research, which is sometimes overlooked. Let's just talk about some kind of specifics, which kind of, if you like, put some flesh on that theoretical bone. This is a study we published last year using data from the English Longitudinal Survey on Aging. It's a sample of over 4,000 people, about 10% of whom are depressed, reflecting, this is over a long period of time, reflecting kind of general population levels of depression, but it's an aging population, so these are people who are over 50. And one of the things that we were looking at, there's lots of things you can use that data to tell you about these processes, but one that's kind of indicative of the general patterns that emerge from that is to look at the, if you like, the trajectory of people who have a history of depression. And what are the things that, if you like, ameliorate depression and, if you like, reduce the risk of relapse. This is the percentage of people who relapse 2 years after one wave of the study as a function of the number of groups that they have joined in the intervening period. Well, if at time one and between time one and time two, you don't join any new groups, then the chance of depression relapse is about 40%. Again, what we know in the population at large. So the risk of relapse is very high, but the most, if you like, I think the effective thing that a person can do to buffer themselves from the risk of relapse is to join new social groups. So you see there that if you belong to 3 or more groups, then effectively your risk of relapse was more than halved. Okay. Some other kind of evidence. This is something, again, that's a study of, again, elderly people, a specific population. Just a completely different type of context, again, to give some indicative evidence. This is, well, sorry, just, I should say too, this is a meta-analysis of all the studies which looked at the relationship between social identity and depression. What you see is a pretty robust relationship across those studies. As I say, there's about 15 of them. And in all of them, you see that negative relationship. So that social identification is associated with lower levels of depression. Moving, as I said, into a different type of context, so that's, you might say, well, depressed people and people who have depression or clinical kind of issues, that's not me. This is a study of just a meta-analysis, I should say that previous work was done by our colleague Tegan Cruis at UQ. This is work done by another of our colleagues, Nick Steffens. This is a meta-analysis of the relationship between social identification and stress in the workplace. Okay, this is 50 studies that look at social identification, the extent to which people identify either with their work team or with the organization that employs them, and their levels of stress, okay, more generally. And again, this is encompassing things like burnout and phasing into anxiety and also depression. What you see in what that data shows is that across a very large number of studies, large number of participants, there's a very reliable relationship so that high levels of social identification are associated with low levels of stress. That's a very robust finding. There's it's a kind of resistant to all manner of statistical tests to, if you like, eliminate it. And so that's your work group identification, and similarly organizational identification. So feeling that you are part of a we, us in this work team or us in this organization, is absolutely critical to mental health in the workplace, which of course has massive kind of economic and other kinds of costs, okay, if it's not addressed successfully. And yet what's interesting, again, I sort of challenge you, is that when people talk about stress, they almost always make it a kind of personal issue. They very rarely talk about it in terms of these group-based kind of processes. And yet our research suggests that group dynamics and the process of social identification are critical to that phenomena. And again, I've used those, if you like, those examples as bookends to encompass the whole spectrum of mental health kind of issues, from depression through to more everyday things like stress. Okay. So again, that data, though, is population-based data and it's correlational. So a question that I think you probably want answered is, okay, well, can you show me kind of what one might do about this? And also, can you establish this a causal relationship between social identification and stress? This is another study that Tegan and we conducted in Brisbane. It was some research that was done with a population of vulnerable participants, some of whom were homeless, others were having other kind of life challenges that they were struggling to overcome. They had made contact with an organization called RecLink Australia. It's a charitable organization. And effectively what RecLink does is to get people who are, as I say, disadvantaged or vulnerable, and identify groups that they might join on the basis of their, if you like, biographical and historical kind of details. And Kath will pick up this thread a little bit later on. Okay, so try to find out what potential social identifications people might have, and then put them in groups and look at what the effect of that is, well, obviously with a view to helping them overcome the various challenges that they face. They approached us because, as is the way in Australia at least, their funding was being cut, and they wanted some evidence that actually what they were doing was worthwhile. They knew it was, but they didn't have the data that the pharmaceutical companies have, if you like, to justify the kinds of things that they wanted to do. So again, we conducted this study over a long period of time, and again, it's ongoing, this research. What we did, looked at people pre this intervention, look at their mental health, and post intervention. And what you see is that on average, participation in this program reduces depression actually very considerably, takes people from kind of on average well above the threshold for depression diagnosis to on average below that threshold. But interestingly too, that effect is moderated by the extent to which people identify with the groups in question. So if I just took anyone here who maybe has some issues or problems and just put you in any old group, one that you don't identify with, is probably not going to have much benefit for your mental health. But if I put you in a group that, if you like, really furnishes you with this sense of we and us, so you feel connection to the people in it, then actually what you see is a massive improvement in mental health over the course of that intervention. Okay, and again, Kath is going to pick that theme up in a minute. So again, just to abstract some kind of themes that are of which this indicative work is indeed speaks to, some of the points. Our ongoing work I think brings robust and rich theory to a range of phenomena that are central to mental health, but we would argue are poorly understood from a kind of mainstream individualistic psychological perspective. Again, in large part because that marginalizes, if you like, the social determinants of mental health. It points to the way in which a neglect of social identity dynamics leads to suboptimal outcomes. I put this picture in again because often when you see Munch's The Scream, you focus on the kind of individual sufferer in the center, and you don't necessarily think about the broader social context. What are those people doing there? How do they relate to that person? What's their role in supporting them or whatever? Are they running away from them or whatever? And actually the point of Munch's painting, or as he describes it, was indeed to, if you like, speak to some of those dynamics. But again, when that picture is kind of reproduced, that's often not what we see. Also, I think this research shows how the power of groups and social identity, which is, as I say, routinely overlooked, can and needs to be harnessed to deliver significant health benefits. And the point I'd make is that individual sufferers need to be understood and treated or managed in the context of their social identities. More broadly, and this is a kind of theoretical analysis that we've done, if you kind of abstract from this literature kind of 5 key practical points about, if you like, turning theory into practice, there are, I think, 5 points that I would want to make. The first is that groups and social identities are critical to mental health. Hopefully I've made that point reasonably convincingly, but again, if I haven't, or you need more proof, more evidence, I've got a bucket load out the back, so to speak, and I'm happy to share that with you. Also, importantly, groups matter, but so does self-categorizations. We have to internalize those groups as part of who we are, so that groups become self-defining. So, you know, us Canadians, that's a self-categorization. I see myself as a member of that social identity, that social category. Also, when it comes to kind of practitioner interventions, the power of social identities is unlocked by working with those group memberships, not across or against them. A lot of my other work is on organizational change, and often when leaders, or when you get a new leader and they do a bit of organizational change, they pay very little attention to the group-based dynamics on the ground. They treat people as if they're blobs on a wiring diagram, and you can cut them up this way and that way and repackage them, and it'll all work smoothly. 80% of organizational restructurings fail. Why? Because they pay no attention to social identity dynamics. If you tackle these kinds of issues in a way that's negligent of the power of social identities, you will always get it wrong. You know, that's just a fundamental point for anyone who's thinking about leadership or all those kinds of things. You've got to think first about what is the nature of the groups that I'm trying to work with. And if you are insensitive to those things, your leadership will fail. That can make you that prediction, you know, dead. It's a fact. Okay. So at another level, it's not, again, a lot of this is not just about social, if you like, talking about or acknowledging social identities. It's also about working with them to make them matter, to turn the idea of us into a practical reality so that people can live out valued identities. Actually, that's something, again, is an important, if you like, secret to leadership. Again, if you think about our membership of this community, it's the fact that we can come together and do something practical and collaborative and that makes us matter, and then is a vehicle for things to kind of move forward. So it's not just about thinking about us, it's about making us matter and making us, if you like, a potent force in the world. And to the extent that you do that, you empower people through social identity, then again, you don't just have positive benefits on mental health, you're actually able to engage in progressive forms of social change. And finally, a point, of course, every, 99% of change and health management that's going on in the world is happening, pretty much oblivious to the things that I'm saying here today. What I would say, though, is whatever you do in this space, even if you completely neglect all the things I'm talking about, what you're doing is, at some level, always having an impact on social identities. So again, if I do some restructuring and I decide to split up a work team, or I decide to cut it this way rather than that way, I'm always, if you like, tinkering with adjusting social identities, and what I do will always have consequences through those identities. I might not acknowledge that, I might recognize it, I might deny it, and a whole range of other things, but that's always the case. And I would also argue that that is at the very heart of, if you like, the political process, the politics of organizational life, the politics of society, that as leaders, as community members, as politicians, we make decisions about which identities to prioritize, which identities to privilege and to listen to, and which ones we're not going to attend to, or which ones we're going to delegitimate in various ways. And so, if you like, I want to argue that, if you like, not just that identity is about psychology, identity is about politics, and indeed it's at the heart of politics. And I don't want to, if you like, deny the political dimensions of what we're talking about, because I think you have to acknowledge this isn't just about the science, it's also about people's willingness to acknowledge particular group-based agendas and to run with them. And again, and what you see in, whether you're talking about Britain or Canada and Australia, is there is some resistance, if you like, to acknowledging and engaging with some identities as distinct from others. And this is the final slide, you'll be pleased to know, and this again, this is a bit of a curtain raiser for what Kath's going to say. Social identity then, I think, and more broadly our aspiration, is that it provides the basis for a potent partnership between social psychologists, or psychologists more generally, and practitioners. And even though, as I pointed before, there's really a lot of work that's really starting to come out, I think that actually we've only really started to scratch the surface of that. In part because it's only in the last couple of years that we have gone out to communities of practitioners, communities of policymakers like yourselves, people who are actually at the coalface, at the cutting edge, dealing with these problems. It's only recently that we've started to have a dialogue about, well, what might this look like in this space? I think that's tremendously kind of exciting work. It's obviously the next phase of our research, and I believe it is indeed genuinely transformational, tremendously exciting. And I know we're kind of very excited, very tired, because we spend a lot of time in aeroplanes. But it's really, it's great to have these conversations around this. And I think that really we're very much at day one of this in a sort of broader scheme of things. So this is very much the beginning. And again, we're still very much at the point where we're very keen to take on board the perspectives and problems and issues that practitioners and the translators of these ideas are grappling with. I think what we're doing in many ways is reintroducing the psychology of the self into clinical theorizing. If you go back into the history of clinical psychology, early on, Freud and others were talking very much about the self, but actually that research got bogged down and it didn't get very far ultimately, so people moved away from the idea that mental health was about the self. And our argument is that that is because that literature always, again, was locked into this idea of the self as something that was based in the individual and their individuality, rather than the self as something that's fundamentally social and grounded in collective identity. I think once you, if you like, make that step change, then it opens up a whole, if you like, vista of intellectual and practical possibilities. Again, this promotes an analysis in which the we of self is central and points to the value of clinical interventions, again, which we're only starting to, if you like, clarify and document, that have that same group-based focus. And finally, the last thing, because I think such interventions develop the skills that allow people to connect or reconnect with meaningful social groups, we expect them to promote resilience and to have enduring benefits. And I say that really as a contrast from, say, shall we say, pharmaceutical intervention. I think drugs absolutely have a place, okay, but part of the problem with drugs is that they induce a certain form of dependence, and that when you come off them, typically the problems that, if you like, that they were covering up or masking resurface. I think we would argue that when you tackle issues of social identity, you get to the core of many, not all, many mental health issues. And by addressing those, then you can build, if you like, an enduring, long-term solution to those problems, which is not only of benefit to the individual sufferer, but also to the groups and communities around them. That's, again, we are starting to get data which I think speaks very much to that point, but again, we need to do the kind of longitudinal kind of research that substantiates those kinds of points. I hold that out as a prediction, as a hypothesis, as a promise, but that is clearly a check that needs to be cashed. And I want to make the point that it is not possible to cash those intellectual checks without the support of very many funding agencies in Australia and in the UK in the past, but in particular, we appreciate the massive support that we've received from CIFAR and from the Canadian community more generally. And I should say too that that support is not just material and financial, it is also, if you like, spiritual, in the sense that we've always felt that Canada has, if you like, is a particularly warm home for our ideas. People have always responded very positively to them, and they've always, if you like, been great partners in the process of developing that. And long may it be so. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. I have a question for us. Why are we here this morning? Why did you come? You could have been doing lots of other things. Why did you come? And all the folks on webcast. You know why we're here? Because we're addicts. What are you talking about? I'd like my few comments to be informed by Gadsby's book, Closing the Mental Gap, Closing the Mind Gap. It's quite powerful. I've reread it a couple of times, most recently. Is that we hunger for answers. We hunger for answers. Like we, according to evolutionary biologists and in terms of Gadsby's kind of run on the things, is we need answers. And you know what? Thank God we're wired that way, because we've survived about 500 million years, apparently, and certainly the last 12,000. It's got us this far because it's been relatively simple issues as farmers and agriculturists. We now have come to a new point in a very, very complex situation. The complex of poverty reduction, of ending homelessness, of the whole issues on mental health. These are not simple situations at all, but we want simple solutions. We're wired to do that. What Alexander is kind of suggesting is, folks, relax. We got to look at things way, way differently. Way differently. Is that, you know, even the notion of self, there's lots been written on that, and the research that he's commented on is phenomenal. But it throws you for a loop. That's not the way I thought of myself as a self. Franco exists. He's here. That kind of stuff. Well, the fact is, without all my relationships, there is no Franco, really. We know that. But that's not, we don't like that answer, okay? Because it's not instinctive. You know, that isn't the way it is. So I think the notion very much is, as I reflect on the presentation, is that we really do have to take a step back, very, very much. We are living in a very, very complex world. All of us in leadership positions in this room, and the wisdom and the people listening in, we got to be very, very careful about how quickly we assume solutions and wanting those simple solutions. They don't exist. In fact, if whoever is here 100 years from now and reflects on this day, they'll say, do you know what they were thinking back on February the 5th in Edmonton? Can you believe that? I often think about that. So we think that we've got it all figured out, or we're going to figure it out. It's not going to happen, folks. But we're going to work really, really hard to get there. So here in Alberta, we all know, many of us in this room, all the 7 cities, we have 10-year plans to end homelessness. We said there won't be a homeless person in 2019 in Alberta. We have housed 8,000 people. We have now realized, what Alexander's mentioning too, that in fact you've got to work within the individual in connections. Just putting them in an apartment will not work. So now we're building some supports to kind of establish that. But I think it's deeper than that, because we don't see those folks as human beings like us. We're the helpers, and they're the helped. A real problem. A real problem. And what I would argue in terms of what the kind of things Alexander said is, paradoxically, the thing that's brought us to this date, our tribalism, is the very thing that in fact could do us in. Because we got to move ourselves to a deeper level. At what point, what's more important? Am I a human being, or am I a Canadian? Or I am a member of the YMCA, or whatever. That gives me part of my identity. How do we get down into the future that really talks about, and there's lots of other writers are saying, is if we don't get there and work deliberately at that, establishing our common humanity, we're doomed as a species. This is dramatic, and this is enough now, and we now know that this is wired into us. So this is why the question becomes, what are we going to do? And this research that Alexander has put before us, and there'll be much, much more research. It's going to continue to evolve. So like any kind of piece of good work that he's presented us, it leaves many more questions and almost no answers. But that's the way it should be. I'm excited by that. Now, when I was 20 years old, I had all the answers, so I didn't have to bother. I really didn't. I really had all the answers. As I get older, I realize that I have fewer and fewer answers and more and more and more questions. But I'm excited about that. I'm excited because there's a future in that. The future, there is no future when you figure you've got the answers. And so I think that's the challenge. CIFAR, I'm so delighted with what's happening here. So I think very much, at the end of the day, the notion for all of us in this room and on the webcast is, what is our own position on this? Will we be mindful for a little bit, just a little, when we're sitting around the leadership tables and that kind of stuff and saying, and ask more questions, many more questions. Don't get hung up with one answer, because in complexity, there is no one solution. It does not exist. As soon as you do that, you have doomed the failure. So we're now saying in poverty reduction in Calgary, because we got a whole strategy and implementing this whole kind of collaborative, and it's going to be very tough. We got to bring all the sectors together, people that never talk to each other, to say how are we going to come at this, because we're all involved. Let me show you just how endemic this is with some folks in the lived voice. We brought working poor and people that are struggling in and out of homelessness. And I was facilitating a small group, not like this, most in 25, 35. He says, you know, we go in and out of shelters. And they have issues. They have some mental health issues. And they said, you know, not one person has ever asked me what I'd like to do. No one person has ever asked me what I'm good at. And another young guy says, I love to draw. So we have to be extremely more mindful, because our natural tendency is to give the answer, give the solution. I'm going to fix you, Franco. No, you're not. No, you're not. We got to come back and accept truly our common humanity. So in some ways, paradoxically, in a sense, what the research is saying is also could do us in. It's paradoxical, because we've got to get beyond that. How do we do that? How do we do that when our identity is tied into our groups? We've got to somehow move it further down. I don't know how that is, maybe more research, maybe 1,000 years from now, maybe 500 years from now. Because this 1300 cc thing here that we all have, I wish sometimes we had no hair, was just a clear bulb, and we could see all the stuff that's going on in our brains continuously, 24/7, because it's going on all the time. That's a fact. And the question would be is only by becoming mindful, taking a moment or two, or reflecting together and asking the real questions. In Alberta, we have a huge issue with the Aboriginal challenges. In Canada, in fact. Okay? The question would be I was in a session a couple of weeks ago, and one of the leaders said, would you please stop doing it to us? We're not a machine to be fixed. I mean, that's how they feel. The racism and so on like that. When will we accept that? Because partly they're the Aboriginals, and this is part of the identity. We're the non-Aboriginals. We happen to be the dominance and the legislative and that kind of stuff. This is so central to our life here in Canada These are real issues. So I think in interest is 2 more speakers and actually 4 more speakers. So let me kind of end. The notion here is questions. Let me end it because I came across this Margaret Wheatley. I just love some of her stuff. But she said this as kind of a way to position our work from today onwards. And she said, there's no power greater than a community discovering what it cares about. You can see a community is more than just a group, right? Ask what's possible, not what's wrong. Keep asking. Notice what you care about. Assume that many others share your dreams. Be brave enough to start a conversation that matters. Talk to people you know. Talk to people you don't know. Talk to people you never talk to. Be intrigued by the differences you hear. Expect to be surprised. Treasure curiosity more than certainty. Invite in everybody who cares to work on what's possible. Acknowledge that everyone is an expert about something. Know that creative solutions come from new connections. Remember, you don't fear people whose story you know. Real listening always brings people closer together. Trust that meaningful conversation can change your world. Rely on human goodness. Stay together. Thank you.